Good evening. It's good to see everyone here again tonight. I'm glad to be here. We're running a little late. I do apologize for my pants. Those of you that have noticed, I got splashed with mud as I stepped out of the car and tried to get as clean as possible. My pants are wet, but they're still muddy. So you're going to have to bear with me on that. This evening's lesson is entitled Lay Aside. You'll notice the ... and that means that whatever was to follow didn't fit in the title. So we went ahead and went with the title Lay Aside, and we're going to talk about what we are to lay aside tonight. Our text is going to be three parts: Hebrews 12:1, James chapter 1:21, and 1 Peter 2:1. Many months ago, we talked about Colossians chapter 3, 12-14, when we talked about there are things that saints are told that we are to put on, and that these are traits of Christ, therefore attributes or traits of God, and that we are told that these are to become ours like a cloak that envelops us. That is compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, forgiveness, and love. These 7 things are to make up our life. He says in verse 12 of Colossians 3, "So as those who've been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another, and forgiving each other. Whoever has a complaint against anyone, just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you. Beyond all these things, put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity." And as we look at that word, put on, not only in verse 12, but also in verse 14, where he says, beyond all these things, put on love. That word put on is enduo. It means to envelop in, to clothe with. Strong 1746, enduo. To envelop in, to clothe with. He's talking about we're putting on these traits of Christ. This isn't, remember we talked this morning and a couple weeks ago, Christianity is not a trial basis. It's not a trial run. We don't just see how we're going to like it and see how far we can get. It's a commitment. It's as much of a commitment as when we put on our clothes in the morning to go out for the day. That's what we do as soon as we get up in the morning to the time we go to bed. We're to wear these characteristics, these traits of God: compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, forgiveness, and love. But before we can clothe ourselves with these things, before we can put these on, there are certain things that saints are told that they are to lay aside. And as we're going to see, that phrase lay aside actually means to take off. So there are things we're told to put on. There are also things that we're told to lay aside or to take off. Hebrews 12:1-2 says to lay aside every weight and sin. And so that's what we're going to be talking about tonight, is laying aside weights and sin. In Hebrews 12:1-2 it says, "Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." And this lay aside that we can read there in this passage is the strong Greek word, Strong's 659. It's a pantithemi. And it's a combination Greek word. That means it's from 2 other words, but it means to put away, both literally and figuratively. It's rendered in the King James as cast off, lay apart, lay aside, lay down, put away, put off. Thayer says of this word that it's a verb that means to put off or aside or away. So when he's saying we're to lay aside every encumbrance and sin, he's meaning put it off. It's not just I'm going to set it down and hang it off my belt, and that's putting it aside. I'm going to put it out of sight in my pocket and carry it with me. He's saying put it off. Cast it away from you so that you can run the race with endurance that's set before us. For those that might be looking around saying, I don't have the outline, there isn't an outline. As I was putting this together, I had it in my head the way I wanted the PowerPoint to look, and I wasn't quite sure how I was going to lay it out yet, and so I just went with the PowerPoint and put it together from there. And I hope that it came together as I was thinking of it in my head. But continuing this thought of laying aside from Hebrews 12:1, it says we're to lay aside every weight and sin. So let's talk about these 2 words. The word weight is a Greek word that's onkos, Strong's 3591. And Strong's renders it as a mass, as bending or bulging by its load. Remember, this isn't something you can just, I'm going to attach to my belt and carry with me. So I have my hands free so I can run. No, he's saying this word is a mass. It's bending or bulging by its load. You shouldn't be carrying it. He says that is a burden or a hindrance. And it's rendered as weight in the King James. And in fact, this is the only place this word occurs, is here in Hebrews 12:1. It's translated weight in the King James, also New King James, or encumbrance, as we read earlier from the New American. It refers to bulk and encumbrance, according to Thomas, on this word, 3591. And bedag. And bedag is a synonym for a Greek to English lexicon. It stands for Bauer, Denker, Arndt, Gingrich. It's also known as the Bauer-Denker lexicon, but it's a Greek to English lexicon. This is a great resource. It's also online, and it is a great tool that they have allowed to be used. BDAG defines this word weight in two ways. Number one, it says it is material that is ponderously large, and I like that word ponderous. Ponderously large, that means you're looking at this huge mass saying, wow, that's huge. He's saying, cast it off of you. He says, material that is ponderously large, it is bulk. Number two, that which hinders one from doing something, a weight, burden, impediment, a figurative extension of one, meaning that a figurative extension of something that is ponderously large or bulk. When we talk about so-and-so has a huge weight on their shoulders, you might use that in that figurative term. It could be referring to the kind of weight that the Hebrew writer says you shouldn't try to run with. And Hebrews 12:1 can thus be rendered, setting aside everything that serves as a hindrance. Setting aside everything that would be an encumbrance or a weight or a bulk or a mass, something that's going to keep you from being able to run, because you're going to be bowed under the load. And the next word that's used there is sin. I put the Greek word. I don't think we need the Greek word. We understand what sin is. It's hamartia, Strong's 266. It's from the Greek word 264 in the Strong's Dictionary, and it means sin, properly or abstract, and it means an offense, sinful, according to Strong's. Thayer says it's identical to 264. One is a noun, one is a verb. It means to miss the mark, to err, to be mistaken. Thayer also goes on to say that to sin means to transgress the divine law. When we use sin in the way that is used in the Scriptures, it's no longer just this archery term that means to miss the mark. It means to transgress divine law. So it's no longer just sinning against what someone else said not to do, it's sinning against God. And so that's the word that's being used here, that strong word. So he's saying, lay aside every weight and the sin that so easily entangles us. That's so we understand what's being talked about. But then thinking about weights. What does he mean by casting off these weights? And we can understand the Greek word, it means this huge load, but what does that mean in a figurative sense? And as we look through the Scriptures, we can see a number of times that we're told to lay aside certain weights. We are to lay aside the weight of worry. Laying aside the weight of worry or anxiousness is found in Matthew 6, 25 to 34. Here Jesus says, don't be anxious over food and drink and clothing, what you're going to eat, what you're going to drink, what you're going to wear the next day. He points to the flowers of the field and he says they're more beautifully arrayed than even Solomon himself. And that God takes care of them. He takes care of the birds of the air. He says, you're much more valuable than the birds of the air. He says, so don't be anxious for these things. But instead, remember what he says in verse 33? He says, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. He says, set your priorities right, and you don't need to worry. You don't need to have that anxiousness, that anxiety over things. While worry is not inherently sinful, it can cause unfruitfulness. In Matthew 13, verse 22, and talking about the different seeds that fell on the wayside, some were on the wayside, some were on the rocks, the weeds, the thorns. He says in Matthew 13, 22, that those thrown on the thorns, well, the worry of the world, the deceitfulness of wealth, choked the word out of them and they became unfruitful. So worry and anxiety can cause us to become unfruitful. Why? Because it takes our focus and our priorities off of God onto something else. And sometimes on a problem we shouldn't worry about because it's not in our control anyway. In Luke chapter 10, 38 to 42, Martha certainly thought there were some things in her control and that Mary should have been helping her. They had Jesus over for dinner and Mary was sitting at the feet of the Master, and Martha's running around and trying to play being a hostess, which is good. But when she tells Jesus, don't let her just sit there, make her help me. Remember what Jesus' response? He says, Martha, Martha, you're worried and bothered by so many things. When he goes on to tell her, she's missing out on what's truly most important. They had the chance to sit at the feet of the Creator himself and ask him whatever questions came to their mind. And Martha was worried and bothered about all these other little things. You can imagine Jesus saying, Martha, the dishes can wait. This is an important event that's taking place. But she was worried and bothered and she couldn't see past that. Worrisome, anxiety, anxiousness, all these things can cause us to become unfruitful because we're thinking about something else. And we dwell so hard on it. You know, you hear people say they're sick with worry. Yeah, we can make ourselves physically sick being anxious over something. Worry is burdensome. If you're going to look in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 28, we don't have time to look at these two passages. But worry is burdensome. In 2 Corinthians 11, verse 28, Paul says, in addition to all that he had been through, going back to verse 23 to 27, beaten times without number, both by his own kin of the Jews and the Romans, who were both his countrymen. He was born a Jew and born a Roman citizen. He belonged to both worlds, but neither once he became one of Christ. He was beaten time without number by both of them. Danger around every corner, shipwrecked 5 times. He says, in addition to all of that, he says his worry or concern daily for all the churches. And the Greek word there for concern is the word for care and anxiety. He says, in addition to all that he had been through, his worry was for all the churches daily. And in Colossians 2, 1-2, Paul says his struggle was for saints at Colossae, Laodicea, and all those saints he had not even met yet. The word struggle there is a Greek word, agon, from Strong's 0073, or just call it 73. It's the word that means contest. When you first look at it, you say, how does Paul's contest is for saints? Well, when you look at the way that word is used, it's a contest as an assembly to watch the games. And it means figuratively, this was one of those idioms that didn't quite translate over well into English, as an idiom that means anxiety, conflict, contention, to fight, to race, as in the games. Paul is saying he had the type of anxiety for the Colossian saints and the Laodicean saints and all saints he hadn't even met yet, the kind of anxiety you have when you're watching the game going, oh, who's going to win? He says he had that kind of anxiety for the churches. Which makes sense because earlier in 2 Corinthians 11:28 he said he had that same kind of concern, care, anxiety for the churches. Anxiety can be burdensome. We're to cast aside the weight of worry. We're also to cast aside the weight of worldliness. 1 John 2, 15-17 talks about the lust of the flesh. And that it doesn't belong in the life of a saint. We spent 2 weeks talking about that. And King David and Bathsheba are a great example of that. We can also throw in the life of Samson as we looked at in the last 2 weeks. 2 Samuel 11 tells us about King David and Bathsheba. David did not avert his eyes. He allowed what he saw to sink deep into his heart and his thoughts. He lusted after Bathsheba. He desired her. He used his power to bring her to him. And he committed adultery with her. And it ultimately resulted in her husband being killed. Ephesians 5:3, not to be named among saints. Colossians 3:5, we're to put to death immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, greed that amounts to idolatry. Ephesians 5:3 says impurity and immorality, greed, not to be named among saints. And David suffered the consequences for the lust of the flesh. 2 Samuel 12, 7-15, where the prophet Nathan tells him, because his confession, he says, I have sinned before the Lord. Nathan says, God has said you will not die, but there are some consequences that are going to happen. The sword will never depart from your house. And it's a sad thing when we look at how that all played out. Well, what I want us to look at is in Psalm 32, 1-5. Place a marker there in Hebrews 12 if you'd like. And turn with me to Psalm 32. And we're going to begin reading in verse 1 and see what this did to David when he gave in to the sin of the flesh. Psalm 32, starting in verse 1. It says it's a psalm of David. It's a masculine. It says, how blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. How blessed is the man to whom the Lord does not impute iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. Verse 3. When I kept silent about my sin, my body wasted away through my groaning all day long. Does that sound like fun? When people talk about the flashy nature of sin and give in and do what you want, do what you please. David's saying he did what he pleased. Look what it did to his soul. He said his body wasted away through his groaning all day long. Does it sound like maybe he was sick with worry? Maybe he was sick with guilt? Yeah, he knew what he did was wrong. And when Nathan the prophet pointed it out to him, he says, I have sinned. And it finally came out, perhaps almost a year after the event. He says, when I kept silent about it. Then verse 4, for day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My vitality was drained away as with the fever heat of summer. I acknowledged my sin to you, and my iniquity I did not hide. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. See? David knows what he's talking about. He begins this psalm saying, how blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. What a weight must have been lifted from his shoulders. He said, I have sinned. And to hear the words, you will not die, the Lord has forgiven you. And he writes, how blessed is the man to whom the Lord does not impute iniquity, whose spirit there is no deceit. Giving in to the lust of the flesh can be quite a weight, can become quite a burden for those who have not seared their consciences to the point that it's bearable. David certainly had not seared his conscience enough to where it was bearable. His body was wasting away until that confession and being made whole again in the eyes of God. And 1 John 2:15-17 tells us we ought not have the lust of the eyes. We're not to love the world or the things in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes. This is covetousness and greed. Colossians 3:5 tells us this amounts to idolatry. There are many different ways the lust of the eyes can play out. One of the ways I wanted to talk about was in 1 Timothy chapter 6. Look with me in 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy 6, starting in verse 7. For we have brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it either. If we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Here in 1 Timothy 6, 7-10, we're told that the pursuit of wealth, and this is the pursuit of wealth at the cost of everything else in their lives, has brought men of faith to ruin and disaster and destruction. Have we known people like that? I think every one of us can name somebody on the top of our minds that has done this. That has brought their family to the brink of ruin because of, I got to try the next get-rich-quick scheme. I got to do this, I got to do that. And that pursuit of wealth takes them down a hole that takes them away from the Lord. Very often, and more often than not. In verses 17-19, instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share. He doesn't say it's a sin to be rich. It doesn't say money is the root of all evil, as we often hear it misquoted and misapplied in the world today. It's the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil. And we can look at two different churches in the book of Revelation, from Revelations chapter 2 and 3, and kind of see the difference. The church at Laodicea was very wealthy. In fact, Jesus says to them that they put their hope and their trust in their riches. They said, we must be fine, we must be doing what's right. And he says, you don't see how naked, how poor, and how wretched you really are. He says, you need to be refined by fire, just like gold. And he says their prescription was to repent, or he'd remove their lampstand. And then on a total contrast to that is the church at Smyrna in Revelation 2, verse 9 and 10. In the church at Smyrna, he says, they were dwelling in poverty, extreme poverty, he says. But to God, who didn't just look at their physical stance. He looked at their hearts and said they were rich. He said they were to remain faithful until death. The Laodiceans were materially blessed, but spiritual paupers. He says they needed to be refined. They needed to repent. So it's not the material blessings that decides whether we are right with God or not. It's what we do with it. And that's why he says, instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited, not to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches. What uncertainty of riches? Remember what Jesus himself said in Matthew chapter 6? After he says you can't serve two masters, you're going to love the one, hate the other. He says, don't store your treasure on earth where it can be stolen, destroyed, or moth-eaten. He says, put your trust, your hope, your treasure in heaven where none of those things can affect it. That's what he's saying, telling the rich here. You might be materially blessed, and that's fine, but don't put your hope in it. Use it for good. He says not only to be materially blessed, but notice what he said in verse 18. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works. They're not only to be physically blessed and be rich physically, but to be spiritually rich. That's what God expects of everyone. And 1 Peter 1:4 tells us that our reservation is in heaven, a treasure that will never fade away. And he says it's reserved for us in heaven. That's where our treasure ought to be. And we need to cast off the weight of the pride of life. 1 John 2:15-17. Do not love the world or the things in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life. The scriptures say a lot about the consequences of pride. We don't have time tonight to read all these passages in Proverbs. I throw them on the slide for you to write down if you would like. What I want us to read is in James chapter 4, 6-10. James chapter 4, starting in verse 6. Well, the Proverbs tell us a lot about the consequences of giving in to pride and not of repenting of pride. And there in 1 Timothy 6, 17-19, Paul even instructed Timothy to make sure those who were materially rich were not conceited. That is, make sure they were not prideful. Because of this, we're told that God is opposed to the proud, but he will exalt the humble. Notice what it says, James chapter 4, starting in verse 6. It says, but he gives a greater grace. Therefore it says, God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be miserable and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning, and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves in the presence of the Lord, and he will exalt you. One of the problems that plagues those who are rich in this world, the reason he said tell them, instruct them not to be conceited, is that so easy times their attitude that, well, we must be doing something right. We don't have to change. I'm reminded of the book of Amos. Amos was sent to the northern 10 tribes of Israel, and he said, you're sitting in your lofty ivory towers, you're eating all these delicatessen foods, and you're eating all these delicacies and all these different things, while the poor are oppressed. There's justice nowhere. And he says, you need to return to me, says the Lord Almighty. And Amos goes on to tell them, you think because you are rich and that you are materially blessed that you're right with God. And yet God is saying, return to me. He says, God has given you these things to give you time to repent. But Israel adopted the attitude, look how blessed we are. We don't need to change. Everything is fine. We're great. So what did the false priest tell Amos? Go back and prophesy in Judah. We don't want to hear. I wonder how many of them were thinking that as the Assyrians carried them away. God is telling us, don't let anything, whether it's the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, or the pride of life, don't let anything weigh you down to the point that you are not humble before him. Not even David the king could get away with that. God said to him, if you go back and look in 2 Samuel chapter 12, he says, was it not enough that I took you from the fields of your father and made you king over all my people? And if all of that was not enough, all you had to do was ask, and I would have given you more. But you took what belonged to someone else. Not even David, with all the riches God had blessed him with, could get away with adultery and murder. God is saying no one is above his law. These things can weigh us down. whether it's the weight of the lust of the flesh, whether it's the weight of the lust of the eyes, or the weight of the pride of life. God is opposed to the proud. He gives grace to the humble. And it is God who will exalt the humble. Continuing in our thought of laying aside, we now come to our text from James chapter 1, verse 21. It says, "Therefore, putting aside all filthiness and all that remains of wickedness, in humility receive the word implanted, which is able to save your souls." That word wickedness is kakia. It's Strong's 2549, and it's from a Greek word, Strong's 2556, that means badness. That is subjectively depravity, or actively malignity, or passively trouble. The King James renders it as evil, malice, maliciousness, naughtiness, and wickedness. Thayer calls this word something that describes wickedness and depravity. And I like the other way that Thayer describes it. Thayer says it's wickedness that is not ashamed to break laws. What can be done with the one who is not ashamed to break laws? The only thing for that person is to be locked away. Right? So when we read of angels that are reserved in chains and darkness, awaiting the day of judgment, and then Jesus tells us in Matthew 25:41, those parted to his left are going to join their company. He says he's going to say to them, "Depart from me, depart from me, you accursed ones, into the eternal fire, prepared for who? For the devil and his angels." That's the kind of company the left side of Jesus is going to keep for all eternity. The only thing that can be done for someone who has no shame to break laws is to be put away. Romans 1:29, this same word is called evil. And in fact, in Romans 1:29 is describing the fall of any society. And what it says about society, it says society will fall when men are full of evil. And many other practices are named after them. Ephesians 4:31 and Colossians 3:8, we're going to talk about these in just a second. Here that word is referred to as malice. And that's what the next thing we're going to talk about. It brings us to our last text for this evening is in 1 Peter 2:1. We're going to spend some time looking at these things here. It says, "Therefore, putting aside," it's that same word that we talked about from Hebrews 12 and in James chapter 1, "putting aside all malice and all deceit and hypocrisy and envy and all slander." This word, all malice, is that same word we just talked about, kakia. James 1:21 calls it wickedness. Romans 1:29, it's called evil. And in Ephesians 4:31, it says we're to put it away, along with bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, slander, and malice. Colossians 3:8, it uses the same word that is used here of putting aside, and it says you are to cast off, to put away, to lay aside anger, wrath, malice, slander, abusive speech. So it's called malice in Ephesians 4:31 and Colossians 3:8. In both of these passages, Paul says, cast it off, lay it aside. It's not worth dragging around. And we're told to put aside all deceit from 1 Peter 2:1. This is the Greek word doulos from Strong's 1388. It means it's from a word called delo. It's an obsolete primary word. Strong says it probably meant to decoy, and it gives you another word to compare, but it basically means a trick or a bait. That is, figuratively, wile. King James renders it as craft, deceit, guile, and subtlety. There's a lot that can be said about deceit. We read there in Psalm chapter 32 that blessed is the man in whom there is no deceit found in his soul or his spirit. In Mark 7:20-23, Jesus said deceit is a product of evil thought. So if we cast off all deceit, we actually need to start with our thoughts. And that's what we have been talking about the last 2 weeks, about transforming ourselves by the renewing of our mind. It begins with our thoughts. It begins with our love and our priorities. Jesus said deceit is a product of evil thinking. In John 1:47, Jesus said of Nathanael, "Behold, an Israelite indeed in whom there is no deceit." This to the guy that said, when they said, "We found the Messiah," remember what he said? "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And that was an old proverb that he was quoting. He said, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And Jesus says of that man, "Behold, an Israelite indeed in whom there is no deceit." And it was actually Nathanael who declared Jesus to be the Son of God, long before Peter did. And in Romans 1:29, society's downfall is when men are full of evil and deceit, well as that list goes on and on to mention other evil and wicked things. 1 Peter 2, verse 22. The interesting thing here is Nathanael said, can anything good come out of Nazareth? 1 Peter 2:22, Jesus had no deceit in him. Peter says that this man that Nathanael once asked, can anything good come out of Nazareth? This man had no deceit found in him. And in fact, the command for us as those who would follow after him, 1 Peter 3:10, we are to be the same. And 1 Peter 3 and verse 10 it says, for the one who desires life, to love and see good days, must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Just as Jesus had no deceit found in him and says that he left for us an example for us to follow, we are to do so even in this. So we're to put it aside. We're to put aside malice, that is wickedness, and all the things entailed with it. We're to put aside all deceit. Does that mean we can hold on to a little bit? No. We're to put it aside. And we're to put aside all hypocrisy. 1 Peter 2:1. This is Hypocrisy, Strong's 52:72. And it means acting under a feigned part. That is, figuratively, deceit. So hypocrisy and deceit go hand in hand, but they can be separate things. And it's also rendered as condemnation, dissimulation, and hypocrisy in the King James. In Matthew 23:28, Jesus called the religious leaders full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Remember what that malice or that word wickedness meant? Someone not ashamed to break laws. Someone not ashamed to break laws is also another word, lawless, because they hold themselves to no law. They are lawless. Jesus is saying that the religious leaders of his day were full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. He said what would happen to those who practice lawlessness back in Matthew 7:21-23. Where he will say, depart from me, I never knew you, you who practice lawlessness. In Galatians 2 and verse 13, we see the dangerous nature of hypocrisy from people that are generally leaders among their peers. Peter's hypocrisy, this is where he was sitting at the table of the Gentiles. The Jews came along and he left them to go sit with the cool kids, as we say today. He left them to go sit with the Jews. And his hypocrisy was on such a scale that the Jews that were with Paul, including Barnabas, were swept away in it. And they went and followed Peter and did what he did. And he caused them all to sin in his committing of hypocrisy. And Paul had to confront him to his face, he says here in Galatians chapter 2. In 1 Timothy 4:1-3, Paul warned Timothy that some would fall away from the faith due to the hypocrisy of false teachers. We're to put it aside because it's dangerous. We're to put it aside because it can lead others astray. We need to put it aside and be aware of what is being taught around us so that we don't fall to the same false teaching that Paul is warning Timothy about. Men that would come from inside the faith, people that he probably looked up to and trusted at one time. And because of their hypocrisy, they fall away and they take people with them. We need to put it aside. We need to put aside all envy. This is one of those words that even spelling it out is hard to pronounce. I think it's thonos, Strong's 53:55, and it says it's probably akin to the base of another word that means ill will, as detraction, that is jealousy or spite. King James renders it as envy. One of the things that stands out in my mind when I hear envy are these two passages, Matthew 27:18 and Mark 15:10. Turn there with me if you would, and read this with me. What Pilate recognized, envy is one of those subtle things that unless it's acted out in, you may never know that your neighbor, your friend, your family member, your relative has envy in their heart. Envy is something that we can hide inside and not let it spill out. However, there are those times, as we're about to read in it's the same occasion but two different ways. There are those times that we act in such a way that everyone around us can see that this envy is very evident. This envy was so evident that when the Jews brought Jesus before Pilate, look what he said of what he recognized about them. In verse 18, we'll back up to verse 17. Actually 15. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the people any one prisoner whom they wanted. So this was Matthew 27, beginning in verse 16. At that time, they were holding a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when the people gathered together, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" Notice verse 18. There was a reason he asked this. It says, "For he knew that because of envy, they had handed him over." Their envy was so evident that Pilate could see that that's really why they delivered Jesus over. Look over in Mark. Mark chapter 15, verse 10. It's the same account, so we'll just read verse 10. He says, "For he was aware that the chief priests had handed him over because of envy." Sometimes envy is one of those slight things that we might keep under control. We feel it inside, boiling at the surface, but we don't act on it. We don't do anything about it. We need to put it in check because it will become a weight and a burden. But there are those times that envy is so filled one's heart that it is absolutely obvious. And here, whether the Jews recognized that's what it was or not, Pilate saw it. And Pilate, who was going to be guilty of all manner of other things, perverting the justice of the land and letting someone he knew to be innocent be scourged and then marched off to be crucified. But he could see the reasoning behind the Jews' thoughts and their actions here. It was because of envy. Therefore, saints are told, put it aside. That means cast it off. Take it completely away from you. All envy. Why? Because it can cause us to do some horrible things. Out of envy, people have taken one another's wives. Out of envy, people have lost their lives because someone wanted what someone else had and they took it at the point of a sword, or in today's times at the point of a knife or a gun. Envy causes all manner of problems. Romans 1:29. Society's downfall is when men are full of evil, deceit, and envy, and other wicked things. Galatians 5:21. Paul tells us envying is a deed of the flesh. If for no other reason we're to cast it off, Paul says it doesn't belong in the life of a saint. It's a deed of the flesh. That means a work of the flesh, something that we should not have in our lives. And we're to put aside all slander. We talked about this particular word, katalalia, Strong's 2636, in two different ways. We talked about it in our Wednesday night class when we were talking about elders, deacons, and their wives. And we talked about it in our Sunday morning adult class in 1 Peter chapter 2, when we got to this passage. Slander means defamation. According to Strong's, it's backbiting, evil speaking, the way the King James renders it. When we talked about this, we talked about all kinds of different things. And without rehashing all the different comments that were said, and they were all good, one of the things that we noted was the difference between gossip and slander. Both are wrong. Both should not be in the life of a Christian. But when we talked about gossip, usually what happens is it's a slip, an accidental slip of some confidential information to someone else that then gets passed around and can come back and hurt or bite the person that confided in that other person. There's a difference between gossip and slander, and that slander is not an accidental slip of some confidential information that they were privy to. Slander is the evil intent. There is intent behind it. It's not just someone casually talking about things that maybe they ought to be more careful with their words about. Slander is with the intent to cause harm. Slander is the intent to do somebody some discredit and to hurt their reputation. 2 Corinthians 12, 20 through 21. Paul says he was worried about the state of the Corinthian congregation when he saw them again. He said he was worried that there would be strife, jealousy, angry tempers, disputes, slanders, gossip, telling you there are two different things, arrogance, and disturbances. And in addition to all of those problems the people might have, he said he was worried he'd find people who had not repented of their sins of impurity, immorality, and sensuality. These are three things that he said to the Galatians in Galatians 5:19 to 21, that they were deeds or works of the flesh. And he said he was worried he was going to find people who had not repented of those things, and the congregation is just allowing it, tolerating it. Paul was worried that he would find strife, jealousy, angry tempers, disputes, slanders, gossip. Slander is one of those things that we need to be careful of. When we're talking with other people, we say something bad about someone else with the intent that we know they're the ones that are going to spread it. we've just committed slander. We need to be very careful with our tongue, that we put aside all slander. We should not have the evil intent in our hearts to cause someone harm with the words that we say about them, or to disseminate some information that we know about them that would cause harm or discredit to their character. There are ways to handle those things. We are to lay aside. That means to put off or aside or away every weight and sin from Hebrews 12:1. All wickedness, James 1:21. All malice from 1 Peter 2:1, and deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander. Only when we lay aside every weight and sin can we truly run the race in such a way to win. In 1 Corinthians 9:24, Paul says, run the race in such a way to win. Remember, again, Christianity is not a trial basis. We don't say, I'm going to start in this race, and if I get too tired, I can just always turn to the side and do my own thing. He says, run the race in such a way as to win. He says, first, before you can ever do it, you have to enter the race. We talked about that this morning and last week, that before we can obey these commands, we must first obey the command to be obedient to the gospel through baptism. That we must come out of the waters of baptism, having put to death that old self. That enters us into the race. We need to have the mindset that we're going to run it to win it. In Hebrews 12:1, we're to lay aside the weights and sin that easily entangles so we can run that race with endurance. And 2 Timothy 4:7, we need to be able to, at the end of our life, if we have the ability to have some time to reflect, be able to say what Paul was able to comfort Timothy with. He says, I have kept the faith, I have fought the fight, I have finished the course. What he's saying is, I have run the race. Paul and the Hebrew writer both have used the analogy of the race or the games to tell us that as saints we need to have that same determination to practice, to have that endurance, and to run in such a way that we can win. Why? Because our souls depend on it. Our souls depend on us hitting that finish line. Paul said he kept the faith, he fought the fight, he finished the course. What he's saying is, that race, that all-important race, I ran it. And in the future there's laid up for me the crown of life. And not just to me, but all those who love his appearing. As we conclude this step, I want us to go back to the beginning of where we started with. After we lay aside every weight and sin, all wickedness, all malice, all deceit, all hypocrisy, all envy, and all slander, there are things we must put on. We can't just take it off and leave it off there and not fill that void. Anytime we remove something negative from our life, we need to fill it with something positive. And therefore, these 7 things that we are to remove, we're also told to put on. Remember, that's that Greek word that means to envelop in, to clothe with. Put on compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, forgiveness, and love, from Colossians 3:12-14. My admonition and encouragement for you this evening is to lay aside the hindrances of sin, whatever form that takes in your life, and put on Christ's character and these virtues from God. This is what we are required to do, to lay aside the practices of the old way of life and to put on the new. And if we can assist you in any way this evening, if you're not a Christian, you need to be, to cast those things off, be ready to make that commitment and put on the characteristics of Christ, to rise from the waters of baptism, no longer living for your own will, no longer living for the lust of the flesh, but to do the will of God. And if you are a Christian here tonight who has not lived the way that you should, maybe you've held on to some of these weights and sin, now's the time to recognize it, cast it off, get it away from you, and make sure you're clothing yourself with these attributes of God. And if we can assist you in any way, the waters of baptism, the prayers of the congregation on your behalf, come forward now while we stand and while we sing.